By the late 1920s, most of the early, jolting, unreliable cars had disappeared. They'd been replaced by cars which were better made, certainly more reliable, better to look at, and which, generally speaking, reached the widest possible market. A market, in fact, which was about to dry up due to the Great Depression of the late 20s and early 30s. That depression sent manufacturer after manufacturer to the wall, but it did one other thing. It gave rise to an era of huge, glorious, multi-cylindered supercars, cars for kings and maharajas and film stars, cars for the very wealthy, cars which attained a standard of refinement and luxury never before or since seen, cars that would live on in history forever. I put the Duesenberg SJ at the beginning of this program because since I first saw a picture of it 25 years ago, it has been my very favourite car. And yet, until now, I'd never seen one in the flesh, and I'd certainly never driven one. Neither of those experiences have changed my opinion one bit. It remains my favourite personal car. Fred and August Duesenberg were building racing and sports cars for some years before this sort of car was what they began to create. And they had been doing so with a great deal of success insofar as the racing circus was concerned, but not so much success commercially. To the extent that in 1926, they were financially in trouble, and they were taken over by one E.L. Cord, a name it would be worthwhile remembering for a few moments. Cord kept Fred Duesenberg on because of his engineering expertise, and he was truly a gifted designer and engineer. But he employed his own body stylists, and he decided to celebrate the takeover and establishment of the Duesenberg, Cord and Auburn empire by building a very special car indeed. And it was the Duesenberg J, which subsequently became this car, the Duesenberg SJ. This is a fantastic motor car by anybody's definition of that word. Almost 7.5 litres in capacity, 350 odd brake horsepower, supercharged, with a 3-speed gearbox that is quite beautiful to use, with enormous and very powerful brakes that do what brakes should always have done, and even go so far as being adjustable so that you could release the amount of pressure being fed in by your foot in case of driving on ice and snow. It was an engineer's dream come true, and so effective was it that the sort of people who bought them were the Clark Gables and the Gary Coopers of the world, and I only mention that because this, in fact, was Gary Cooper's car. Wherrett Lobbin Cord was famous for another car, of course, one which bore his own name, the Cord. First seen the light of day in 1929, it was the first large-scale front-wheel drive car to come out of the United States. The first model wasn't a success, though, and they only sold about 4,000 of it. But this one, the 812, released in 1935, was an immediate sales success. Actually, it was released before the front-wheel drive unit was completely developed, and that meant that it gave problems. And that occurred all too frequently in the history of Cord. Innovative and magnificent, they were also unreliable and uneconomical, and the public learned very quickly not to trust them. By 1938, the receivers had moved in, and the Auburn Duesenberg Cord group had been wound up. Almost everything about the 812 was innovative, so much so that had the company been in a position to take advantage of post-war technology, it could have been a great success. But Cord's philosophy was to build the cars of tomorrow, not the cars of today. And sadly, it's the cars of today that most people want to buy. Cord's philosophy put him out of business, and his marvellous white elephants rapidly became collector's items. While some manufacturers were experiencing economic difficulties during the 1930s, others were going great guns. In 1937, for example, Packard had a record year, selling 110,000 units. James Ward Packard began building cars in 1899 when a Winton that he owned continually broke down and he became very disenchanted with it. He was always a small manufacturer by GM and Ford standards, but he had equally always insisted on a very high standard of quality control. And he'd had the sense to surround himself with people who really knew their business. Hence the quite magnificent V12 and straight 8 Packards of the early to mid-30s, which put the Packard name right on the top of the American luxury car market. You may well ask why it is that we're taking such a beautiful car off the highway and onto very rough roads. But it's as well to remember that in 1934 there were still literally hundreds of thousands of miles of unmade roads. And therefore cars were built to accept conditions other than those which might be considered to be ideal. The Packards did it very well because they were very strong and had a very rugged chassis. They had long travel suspension by semi-elliptic springs front and rear, but with good control over those springs with what were relatively new piston-style shock absorbers, and a side valve straight 8 engine of excellent power and even better torque characteristics, meaning that it could pull up almost any hill with no problem at all. By 1930, Rolls-Royce had been in business for nearly 30 years. Very few people disputed their claim that theirs was the best car in the world. And it's true that there were some incredibly good Rolls-Royces. This one's claim to fame is that it is probably the last true handmade luxury car that the world will ever see. This is the Phantom III of 1936. And it was the first Rolls-Royce to be made completely outside the influence of Sir Henry Royce, who died in 1934. It's a V12, just over 7 litres in capacity, 2 plugs per cylinder, 24 spark plugs to replace, 4-speed gearbox with synchromesh on top, on third and on second, but not on first. Nobody cared too much because you didn't have to use first gear except for moving off anyway. Such was the torque and the smoothness of a truly magnificent engine. Steering a bit heavy because it's a big and very heavy car, but not unpleasant once it's moving. Nevertheless, for people like me who could probably never afford to own a Rolls-Royce of any kind, I can't ever think about it as being a car. It always seems to me that it needs to have me sitting in the back and a chauffeur up front, in which case it loses its personality and simply becomes a means of transport. Doesn't mean it's any the less beautiful, it just isn't a truly practical car. Incidentally, the RR insignia was not changed to black in colour because of the death of Sir Henry Royce, as many people believe. It was changed to black because the red that it previously used clashed with some of Rolls-Royce's body colours. That great British motoring name, Bentley, only just made it into the 30s, despite huge successes in racing and despite excellent design and engineering, and despite the fact they were extremely popular with those who bought them. The W.O. Bentley organisation was in deep financial trouble by 1931. Just before their demise, Bentleys produced this car, the fearsome, angry, beautiful 8-litre sports car. It's the car for the Saints and the James Bonds of the world, and in fact it's held in such veneration that there are still a large number of them all around the world, lovingly maintained and restored. Is a marvellous car to drive. Big, strong, powerful, and if the ladies will forgive me, very masculine. In fact, it was this very engine that ultimately brought about Bentley's undoing. Rolls-Royce recognised it as a threat, and they knew that Bentley was in trouble, and they also knew that Napier were making an offer to take over the organisation, so they stepped in with an even bigger offer and acquired possession of the Bentley organisation and then promptly scrapped the 8-litre engine. Competition is stiff, it seems, even among gentlemen. The opulent and quite magnificent cars of the 30s were eventually destined to failure simply on economic grounds alone. Most of them had gone by the end of that period, with the exception of Rolls-Royce, who seemed to be able to go on forever. But one car of some luxury and very modest price was actually born in the 1930s. The Swallow Sidecar Company, under the direction of William Lyons, had taken some standard cars, and I mean capital S standard, and made modifications to them to create a car of their own design, which they called the SS, and which Sir William Lyons later on would never quite reveal whether that meant Swallow Special or Standard Swallow, but SS is what it was called until 1934, when they added one more name and called it the SS Jaguar. And of course that's what it ultimately became. In 1945 it was called the Jaguar Company rather than the SS, because at that stage, SS had some rather nasty connotations. Like all the sports cars of the period, a little bit difficult to get into. You can sort of organise yourself. Interesting thing about the ergonomics of the day, in fact, cars were built to be driven, but they weren't driven in the same way that we think of driving cars today. You know, you can't sort of sit back and relax and get your arms out. They were fairly heavy in the steering, and they needed a big steering wheel, and you needed to be fairly close to be able to get in behind that steering wheel and put some effort into it. Otherwise you wouldn't have got around the corners, particularly when you were going fairly quickly on tight curves and things like that. This is a fairly late 30s example of the Marque, the SS 100, 3.5 litre engine. Good power, terrific power, and a nice little exhaust note to go with it.
Good brakes, good handling, a bit spirited, jumps about a bit, and all sports cars of the period did. Good driving position, a gear shift lever, 4 speeds, it falls right to hand. It's got a great deal of appeal from the point of view of it being a true sports car. And because it was one of the bigger engine sports cars and had a bit more power than the average sports car that was around at the time, and because following along Jaguar's traditional lines it was reasonably inexpensive, it was very, very popular, and it established the Marque for later years. Hence, as I said earlier, they were born during a period when lots of other cars like them were dying. If you were a gay young blade of the early 30s, and if you were very wealthy, you might have thought about spending your winters somewhere warm, maybe panther chasing in India, in which case the chances are you might have had a car specially built for you, just like this Hispano Suiza. Hispanos were the stuff that dreams were made of, magnificently designed and executed. They were the subject of substantial bets, like the one made by the French businessman C.T. Wayman, who wagered against the American Stutz over 24 hours at Indianapolis. His money was never in doubt. The Stutz gave up after 19 hours. In France, this same luxury car market was fed principally by Delage, cars built by Louis Delage, of which this D8 is a classic example. The D8 was built from 1928 right through until 1934 and was a so-called classic luxury car, but I think principally on the basis of what it looked like rather than what it actually was, because it definitely needed a few mechanical refinements to bring it up to the standards of other cars of the period. There's no question, however, that it looked terrific. Finally, Delage couldn't handle the problems of building luxury cars on a grand scale and went under, and the organisation was absorbed in 1935 by Delahaye, and poor old Louis was literally pensioned off into low-income obscurity. Some companies survived the Depression intact. In Italy, Fiat built a range of luxury cars for the 30s, but they also built cheap cars like the Topolino, and that gave them the flexibility to survive the storm. This is Fiat's 525S. It was built from 1929 to 1932, right in the depths of the Depression. It's a true luxury car in terms of its finish and appointments, but it's substantially smaller than what the Americans considered a luxury car should be. And it has one other specifically endearing feature. It is very simple, thus proving that to be luxurious does not necessarily mean to be complicated. It's really quite nice to drive. It's got plenty of power and yet has a simple operational gearbox, clutch, brakes. Everything seems to work properly and it really feels nice to sit in. Not all the great cars of the 30s were luxury cars. It was also an era of great sports cars and great racing cars. For sports fans, nothing surpassed the quite fabulous 1750 and 2.3 litre Alfa Romeo models of the 30s. Both were supercharged, both had exhilarating styling and performance. The 2.3 8C was the forerunner to the wildly exciting Vittorio Jano designed P2 and P3 Grand Prix racing cars. This is the P3, nothing quite like it in the world. And this is what it was developed from, the 2.3 litre 8C supercharged. It's a great pity that this particular Alfa is a bit tired and not in the right sort of condition to be driven hard and fast. Even so, one can get a definite impression of what it must have been like. It has a fabulous engine, really fantastic power, and an incredible amount of torque, which means that it has the capacity to perform right throughout the range, regardless of its gear. I can get a very clear picture of myself competing, if you like, with the Nuvolaris and the Caracciolas of the day in a car just like this. Wonderful gearbox, a little bit slow but very effective, absolutely brilliant handling and brakes. Probably, in fact, the best that I've ever used in a car of this vintage, and certainly a great deal better than about half the cars available today. The ultimate sports car, of course, is the Grand Prix car, and the 30s was an era of fantastic GP racing, of names like Alfas, Auto Union, Mercedes, and Maseratis like this 8CM, and of drivers like Caracciola, Seaman, and Nuvolari who drove this car. The major influence of the era was Adolf Hitler, who was determined to dominate the GP scene, and Daimler-Benz and Auto Union were encouraged to build vast, brutish races, very ungainly compared with the contemporary Italian designs, but very fast nevertheless. On the roads, however, Mercedes' styling was somewhat less aggressive. This is the 500k of the mid-30s. 500 for its 5-litre engine, which was in straight 8-cylinder configuration and 2-stage supercharged, meaning of course that you could run without the supercharger, or if it was your choice, simply kick the throttle open all the way and engage the supercharger to get additional performance, and that additional performance was quite spectacular. It's a big car and it has a big car feel about it. In other words, it's heavy, a bit cumbersome, and certainly the best way to drive it would have been fast, because the faster, the lighter. I can imagine all sorts of pictures of German army officers touring around in 500k Mercedes, feeling very full of their own importance, because that's precisely the way one feels driving it. If it is somewhat over-engineered, it really didn't matter, because the people who owned them were wealthy enough to engage the very best mechanics to look after them. In this day and age, however, it's certainly not the easiest thing to own or maintain, and that brings one back to thinking that maybe simplicity is the answer after all. But by now, the writing was on the wall. Economic conditions were making it impossible for all but the very largest manufacturers to continue the path of perfection. The great luxury cars were doomed. At the same time that Dr. Ferdinand Porsche was designing the awe-inspiring auto unions which helped to take Grand Prix supremacy for Germany, he was working away at another drawing board, fulfilling a promise made by Hitler to produce a German people's car for 999 marks. How ironical it is that the era which gave birth to the great cars should have given way to the era which gave birth to Volkswagen's Beetle. By the end of 1938, over 150,000 advanced orders had been taken for this vehicle, but production was not due to start until 1940, and none of those private orders were destined to be filled. VW, like the rest of the world, had other priorities.